In 1883, the most conservative chancellor in Europe did something no one expected. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, a man who despised socialists and had tried to ban their party, presented before the Reichstag a law mandating health insurance for workers. He did not do it out of compassion. He did it out of calculation. The Social Democrats were gaining votes at an alarming pace. If the state did not offer social protection, workers would ask the revolutionaries for it. Bismarck said it without euphemism: a man who has a state pension is much less dangerous than one who has nothing to lose. That is how the welfare state was born. Not as a left-wing project. Not as an act of generosity. But as a survival strategy for the established order. And that ambiguity has accompanied it ever since. In the previous episodes we have walked through the great isms. Capitalism as a system. Liberalism as a philosophy. Socialism as a family of ideas. Communism as a radical experiment. But most 20th century democracies did not choose any of these models in their pure form. They chose a hybrid. A system where markets continue to function, private property is respected, and companies compete, but the state intervenes to guarantee certain minimums: healthcare, education, pensions, protection against unemployment. That hybrid is the welfare state. And its history is more complex than it appears. Bismarck's social insurance expanded rapidly. In 1883 came health insurance. In 1884, workplace accident insurance. In 1889, old age pensions. Germany became the first country in the world with a complete social protection system funded by contributions from workers and employers. The model was contributory. You paid while you worked and received when you needed it. It was not universal, it covered only industrial workers. And it was not generous, pensions were modest. But it established a principle that would change politics forever. The state has a responsibility to protect its citizens against economic risks they cannot face alone. Other countries followed suit. France, Austria, the Nordic countries. Each with local variations, but with the same central idea. The second great leap came from an unexpected place. In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, the British government asked a civil servant named William Beveridge to write a report on social services. What Beveridge delivered was far more than a technical report. It was a manifesto. Beveridge identified 5 giant evils that the state should fight: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And he proposed a universal system, not tied to employment, that would cover all citizens from the cradle to the grave. The Beveridge report became a phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands of copies were sold. Allied troops read it in the trenches. And after the war, Clement Attlee's Labour government made it reality. The National Health Service was born in 1948. Free healthcare for everyone, funded by general taxation. The welfare state is not only a matter of solidarity or justice. It has an economic logic that its defenders articulate with technical arguments. The first is market failure in insurance. Private insurance markets work poorly when risks are very large or very unpredictable. A private insurer can cover the risk of a car accident. But covering the risk of a pandemic, a massive recession, or a lifelong chronic illness is much harder. The state, by covering the entire population, can diversify those risks in a way no private insurer can. The second argument is investment in human capital. A child who grows up well nourished, with access to healthcare and education, becomes a more productive adult. Public spending on education and healthcare is not just spending, its defenders say. It is investment with economic returns. The third is social stability. Countries with solid safety nets tend to have fewer labor conflicts, less crime, and more social cohesion. That reduces costs for businesses and for the state. Against these arguments, critics of the welfare state present others that are equally serious. The tax burden. Financing universal benefits requires high taxes. And high taxes, they argue, reduce incentives to work, invest, and start businesses. The empirical evidence on this point is mixed. The Nordic countries have extremely high taxes and very competitive economies, which complicates the thesis that high taxes always damage growth. Moral hazard. If the state protects you against unemployment, do you have less incentive to look for work? Studies show small but real effects. System design matters enormously. A generous benefit with a time limit has very different effects than an indefinite one. Demographic sustainability. The welfare state was designed when there were many young workers for every retiree. As the population ages and birth rates fall, the ratio inverts. Fewer and fewer workers support more and more pensioners. This is perhaps the most serious challenge the model faces. In 1990, the Danish sociologist Gösta Esping Andersen published a book that transformed how we think about the welfare state. He argued that there is not one model, but at least three. The liberal model, represented by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Modest benefits, focused on the poorest, with a strong emphasis on the market as the primary provider. Those who can afford it pay for their own health insurance, their own pension plan, their children's university. The state only intervenes as a last safety net. The conservative or corporatist model, represented by Germany, France, and Austria. More generous benefits, but tied to employment and occupational status. Those who have contributed more receive more. Class differences are reproduced in the welfare system. The family plays a central role as a unit of protection. The social democratic model, represented by Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Universal and generous benefits, funded by high taxes, available to all citizens regardless of employment or income. The explicit goal is equality, not just minimal protection. Each model has strengths and weaknesses. The liberal one maximizes individual freedom but leaves people without resources unprotected. The conservative one maintains stability but perpetuates inequalities. The social democratic one achieves more equality but requires a tax burden that not all countries can sustain politically. None is objectively superior. The choice among them depends on what a society values most: individual freedom, social stability, or equality of outcomes. The welfare state was born in an era of factories, stable employment, and single-income families. The 21st century economy looks very little like that. Employment is increasingly precarious. Temporary contracts, involuntary self-employment, and the platform economy leave millions of people outside the contributory systems designed for workers with permanent jobs. If you never contribute enough, you never generate entitlements. Globalization limits fiscal capacity. If a country raises corporate taxes too much, companies can relocate to jurisdictions with lower tax burdens. Tax competition between countries is a real brake on welfare financing, although its magnitude is debated. Demographic aging is the elephant in the room. Japan, Germany, Spain, and Italy already have more people over 65 than under 15. Pensions absorb a growing share of public budgets. And the solutions are all unpopular: working longer, receiving smaller pensions, raising contributions, or increasing immigration. In response to these challenges, some voices propose rethinking the model from scratch. Universal basic income, which we will see in Part 14, is one of those proposals. Others advocate adapting the current system without radically changing it. The debate is far from settled. For a family, the welfare state is not an abstraction. It is the difference between being able to see a doctor or not. Between having a pension or depending on your children. Between being able to study or having to work from the age of 14. In countries with solid systems, a serious illness in the family does not mean financial ruin. Unemployment is a blow, but not a fall into the abyss. Old age is not synonymous with poverty. In countries without that net, every personal crisis is also an economic crisis. An accident, an illness, a recession can wipe out a lifetime of savings in months. Economic anxiety becomes a constant. But the welfare state also has real costs for families. High taxes reduce disposable income. Bureaucracy can be frustrating. And dependence on the state can erode individual initiative and community bonds. The question is not whether the welfare state is good or bad. The question is what design best balances protection with freedom, solidarity with responsibility, security with sustainability. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the welfare state was born as a conservative strategy, not as a socialist project. Bismarck created it to hold back the socialists. Beveridge universalized it during a war. Its pragmatic origins explain its longevity. It works because it responds to real needs, not to an ideology. Second, there are at least 3 models of welfare: the liberal, the conservative, and the social democratic, with very different results in equality, freedom, and sustainability. None is objectively superior. The choice depends on each society's priorities. Third, demographic aging, the precarization of employment, and globalization threaten the sustainability of the model as we know it. Adapting the welfare state to the 21st century is one of the great economic challenges of our time. In the 1970s, the welfare state entered a crisis. Economies were stagnating, inflation was soaring, and a new generation of economists and politicians had a radical answer: dismantle state intervention and let markets self-regulate. They called it liberalization. Their critics called it neoliberalism. Next time.